TV.
Well, leaders in the country have sent in their messages of condolences to the family of the fallen cabinet secretary. Let's take a look at some of those messages. We'll start with President William Ruto's message, who's led the country in condoling with the family of the fallen cabinet secretary, tweeting a thread reading, and I quote, "I have learnt with great sorrow about the passing of Professor George Magoha. Professor Magoha is a towering giant of our time, a great man who stood tall in the academy, where he excelled in learning, teaching and research, as well as in administration, where he led a robust turnaround interventions at the University of Nairobi and the exams cancelled." The president further adding that Professor Magoha also famously served as the Cabinet Secretary for Education. Throughout his tenure, he has evinced a commitment of high standards in the public service and an uncompromising integrity. On the other hand, Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua has also sent in his message of condolence to the family of the fallen CS, saying, and I quote, "I have learnt of the demise of Professor Magoha with great shock. Known for his independence of mind and fearlessness, Professor Magoha was an accomplished professional who served Kenya with zeal, as witnessed when he served as a CS for Education and other posts held earlier." And away from that, we do also have other leaders. We have Azimio la Umoja leader Raila Odinga, who also tweeted his message of condolence, indicating that, and I quote, "I am deeply saddened to learn of the passing of Professor George Magoha, a transformational leader, illustrious scholar, dedicated public servant, and a distinguished medical doctor who left an indelible mark on the country's education system." And also we do have Wiper leader Kalonzo Musyoka through his Twitter handle, saying the news of the untimely passing of Professor George Magoha has suddenly left all of us in shock. He epitomized the necessity of the focus, hard work and diligence. He was an exceptional leader who will be greatly missed. I send my sincere condolences to Professor Magoha's family, friends and colleagues. Signed there. Well, Professor Magoha was known as a tough-talking and no-nonsense cabinet secretary during his time at the Education Ministry. He was the face of the competency-based curriculum for 3 years, where he spearheaded changes to the curriculum. Well, news of his death comes just days after Maseno University announced that he would be joining the institution as a professor of surgery at the School of Medicine. Magoha once said, "The greatest wealth an individual can have is humility and contentment with what they have." Let's have a look at some of his memorable quotes.
How can a stray boy be arrogant? We were trained to be servant leaders, trained to be leaders by example. That's why you see me everywhere. So I'm telling you this so that you don't listen to any other description of Magoha, son of Magoha, that you may hear from somewhere else. But I shall be firm with myself, with you and with anybody else, and that firmness together with truthfulness and neighborliness, then we shall move forward. When I was about to sit for common entrance examination in 1963, are we together? I was in a place called Gina Primary School. I saw the resources we had there. So when I came to Standard 5 in Nairobi at Dr. David Livingstone, it was like I was in heaven. That is not going to change. Stop pretending. Just make sure that, and I passed from that bush. So my job is to ensure that a child in the remotest part of this country is not disadvantaged.
First of all, mimi ni sura mbaya. Lakini hiyo sura yangu mbaya mimi napenda zaidi. Do you get the point? Now there is a plastic surgery that is good for the surgeon, and I'm sure I have plastic surgeons here who will tell you that there are aspects of plastic surgery that are therapeutic. If you look at, now that he's dead, I can talk about Michael Jackson. He was more beautiful before he did all that plastic surgery. So with my big nose, I think I'm very, very, hata kama ni sura mbaya, I love my body.
You mentioned that you had expectations in this practice.
The government of the Republic of Kenya. Kwanza wewe unatoka wapi? Who are you representing? Because if you are representing Al-Shabaab, I'm not answering. Which TV station? NTV. Yes, NTV is a good station. Don't listen to the politicians. The politicians did not help you to produce your children. We produced our children with our own blood. Let the politician keep his own children at home. For us, all our children are going to go back to school. And I'm not the type who usually pleads, but this time let me plead to them. If I, as a cabinet secretary, cannot cane a child, who do you think you are as an ordinary teacher to cane somebody's child like that?
For our children, their being in school is going to be permanent. And that we should be very, very careful just changing something because you don't like the person who initiated it. I think life is much bigger than that. Whoever becomes CS education, if he's a full-blooded Kenyan and not a thief, his job would be to make sure that another 10,000 classrooms are built.
And we'll be coming back to take a look at the life and times of the now late Professor George Magoha. Meanwhile, on other stories, NTV has learnt that the deadly blast at a gold mine shaft in Nandi County was as a result of a dispute between Karebe Mining Company and a rival company linked to a senior government officer. Now, 3 people died on Monday after a rival group detonated dynamite at the mine shaft belonging to Karebe Mining Company. Gabriel Kudaka has the details.
The search for gold in Tinderet, Nandi County turned into a tragedy on Monday. 3 people died after a group of miners detonated dynamites in a mine shaft belonging to Karebe Mining Company. A survivor of the deadly blast, Joseph Odhiambo, says a rival group blasted the mine shaft without warning.
Hatukujua kitu chochote yenye inaweza tokelezea. Mimi kama mmoja yao mwenye tulikuwa naye kwa simu, nilistuka tu nimetoka from where I was mpaka penye niko ilikuwa katu kama 15 meters.
The deaths have lifted the lead on a long-standing and deep-seated dispute between Karebe Mining Company and another miner linked to a senior government officer. Area residents are now pointing fingers at the leadership of the county for failing to settle the dispute.
Serikali tunalilia. Hii watu wanasema ya kwamba tuna covered by His Excellency the President of Kenya. Tunataka kujua ni kweli ama ni uongo.
Mtu akifa upande ule ni uchungu, akikufa pande ni uchungu. Lakini chanzo ya hii maneno yote inatoka wapi? Hata tukikaa hapa hivi tuwalaumu wale officers wenye wanaletwa wakienda. Watakuja hao leo wengine waletwe hao wanaenda.
There are big people in the government who are misusing the name of the president. And that is the reason, Mr. Chairman, you heard these old men saying, they've always been saying that they are guarded by the president. No, it is not the president. They are being guarded by the people who are next to the president.
Charlie Tryon, the director of Karebe Mining Company, regretted the incident as well as the long-drawn dispute that has now turned tragic.
So many officers, and we complained through letters, through meetings, through phone calls, almost daily. And we didn't get the support we needed from the authorities, I'm sorry to say.
This is the main entrance to Karebe Gold Mine Tunnel where 3 people lost their lives following a blast. Efforts to speak to security officers in Tinderet were futile as police officers chased away journalists from the scene of the blast. Gabriel Kudaka, NTV.
Well, hundreds of people are at the risk of contracting cholera in Kenya across 9 counties. This is according to the Ministry of Health. Now, Kenyans have been urged to be vigilant and maintain high levels of hygiene and the use of clean water to avert the spread of cholera. This comes as 4 people have died in Wajir, while 100 others are currently receiving treatment.
Kenya has recorded 4,173 cases of cholera since the outbreak in October 2022. The increasing numbers across have since forced various stakeholders to put their heads together to help avert a possible out-of-hand situation.
With 72 deaths reported over the same period of time. The total number of counties affected has been 14. 5 counties have managed to be able to bring the outbreak to total control, but we still have 9 counties which have active cases of cholera.
The counties grappling the effects of the disease include Kiambu, Nairobi, Murang'a, Kajiado, Nakuru, Uasin Gishu, and Wajir. In Wajir County, at least 4 people have died following the outbreak of cholera, while 100 others are receiving treatment. The situation on the ground is dire following lack of sufficient medical and bed access. Stripped of their energy, some opt to lay on their ground as they await medical treatment.
Amekuwa cholera zaidi sana. Watu karibu hata hana hospitali hapo.
Maji ndio shida. Tunahitaji watabuza ambaye ni standby.
Wajir County says it has put in measures in place to help curb the spread of the disease.
We are managing well. We are doing contact tracing. We've done water tracking. We've also formed a rapid response team who are there on the ground.
We are working with the counties to ensure that we supply chlorine tablets. We are working again to ensure that we send messages using the community health volunteers.
The Ministry of Health has urged Kenyans to heighten their hygiene levels in the wake of the disease to prevent more infections across the country. Helen Aura, NTV.
Well, members of parliament for the second day stormed out of the induction seminar in Mombasa, protesting the delay in the release of the National Government Constituency Development Fund. They're still agitating for payment of the 100 million shillings per constituency, accusing the national government of withholding the monies despite having been captured in the budget. Kevin Mutai has more from Mombasa.
Members of Parliament are still at loggerheads with the national government, derailing the start of the induction workshop by 2 days now. The lawmakers walked out of the conference room a few minutes after a plenary session was convened, insisting that they'll not be part of the seminar unless they receive the NGCDF payments in their respective accounts.
Unless we get 100 million shillings per constituency, we are not going to participate in any parliamentary business going forward. We are not going to leave Mombasa, and we are not going to sit in any induction without the money in our accounts.
The lawmakers arrived in the port city on Sunday for the induction retreat, but drama started on Monday when they unanimously boycotted the sittings, citing delay in issuing bursaries to their constituents, therefore inconveniencing students depending on the kitty to go back to school.
Imekuwa ni sasa kizungumkuti na kuzungushana, mara tutatoa, mara hatutatoa. Shule zimefunguliwa. Mimi na zaidi ya watoto 1400 ambao wanatakiwa waingie katika kidato cha kwanza.
Mimi nimelipa ma school fees, nimechoka. Na mimi nafikiri ni wakati mwafaka sasa serikali iangalie mambo muhimu kama elimu, si mambo ya kupuuzilia mbali. Watoto leo wako nyumbani, sisi tuzunguka humu kwenye mahoteli tu, tukikaa tunywe machai, tunywe nini? Hapana.
We will start impeaching people in this house. We don't want to joke with the lives of our students, our people, of the poor in the constituency. It is pure balderdash to come and entertain nonsensical, comical and ridiculous activities being done here.
Efforts by the National Treasury Principal Secretary Chris Kipto to calm the waters proved unsuccessful as the lawmakers demanded a share of the more than 7 billion shillings collected by the national government every day. They claimed they were promised 2 billion shillings every 2 weeks, accusing the Treasury of playing games as the debacle continues.
He came to request us to proceed with the meeting and he has no solution. He is not part of the solution, he is part of the problem. And they ought to have projected ahead the money that was supposed to be given to us. We have only 4 months remaining to the end of this financial year. We've not been paid anything.
President William Ruto, who jetted out of the country Monday, is expected at the workshop next week ahead of the post-election seminar scheduled after the induction of members of the House committees that will end on the 4th of February 2022.
The leadership of the House will decide what to do. To me, I find it a bit immoral to continue staying here if we are not proceeding with what brought us here. I am chair of Public Accounts Committee. I feel very embarrassed. I had invited resource persons from outside to talk or speak to my committee members.
Kevin Mutai, NTV in Mombasa.
All right, at this point, let's now take a look at what's in the dailies. And I'm not alone in studio. Joining me this morning to have this conversation and also just help me go through the newspaper is Dismas Mokua, political risk analyst. A very good morning, Dismas.
Good morning.
Karibu sana to M Live back. New year.
Yeah.
Good things. Hesbon Owila, media and political communications expert. Thank you so much, Hesbon, for coming in through this morning. I think we should now begin with the Daily Nation. And this is certainly what most of the newspapers have headlined. George Magoha, professor, the no-nonsense former education cabinet secretary, renowned professor of medicine and tough university administrator, died suddenly of cardiac arrest last evening, dealing a double blow to a family that was preparing to bury another son, that is Professor Richard Magoha, this weekend. That is Professor Magoha's brother, Richard Magoha, was expected to be buried this weekend on Saturday. Let me begin with you, Dismas. So this is quite shocking and especially hitting hard the education sector in the country. Just to give tribute from where you stand as well, what is most remarkable for you when you remember Professor George Magoha at the helm of the education sector?
Well, my condolences to family, friends, and the entire nation. Actually, the entire world, because Professor Magoha is highly regarded, not just in Kenya, but all over the world. And he demonstrated what leadership is all about, because when he was given a responsibility, he took it with a high-level energy and delivered value. At the same time, Professor Magoha respected authority. You would actually recall that wherever he made public statements, he always reminded all and sundry that he was President Kenyatta's appointee.
Right.
So it seems to me that his leadership philosophy was, number one, you have to respect the appointing authority. You have to respect the person who has given you responsibility and power. And then number two, you have to execute the agenda without coming up with any reasons. He never created excuses if he failed to achieve objectives, and he took personal responsibility. But on the flip side, watching what happened at the funeral home last evening, a number of professionals that raised very pertinent issues, and it's a recurring thing that probably as a nation, Kenya has not invested sufficient resources in emergency medicine, because a number of doctors, the young ones of the KPMDU, indicated that part of the reason why they've been going on strike almost on a daily basis is to get sufficient resources for emergency medicine.
Right.
And if you speak to people in the healthcare sector, or even people who lost their loved ones, they actually say that one of the biggest challenges in Kenya is emergency medicine. That an issue like this, the cardiac arrest, if you had a very agile emergency medical infrastructure, then probably a life would have been saved. This may not be the right time to start asking those questions, but I think if you want to make progress as a nation, those are very pertinent. Because I speak this as a victim. My brother passed on, and people suggested that had we had a solid, medical emergency infrastructure, then probably his life would have been saved.
Right. Hesbon, I want to get your remarks on this untimely news. Quite shocking indeed.
Well, I think it was quite shocking. Yesterday, around the afternoon, we were actually talking about Professor Magoha and the education system. I mean, how he rose up to the top echelons of his profession.
Right.
Everywhere Magoha went, I think he demonstrated diligence. Good example to Kenyans on how your professional diligence can take you up to the top. The University of Nairobi as the Vice Chancellor, served with distinction, left there, went to Kenya National Examination Council, served with distinction. Then we know what he did in the ministry. So we were having this conversation that he had gone back, to my alma mater, Maseno University, as a medicine professor. Then a few minutes later, then we got the shocking news, which is a big loss to this country and the world. And my heartfelt condolences to their family. What they're going through must be very devastating. I mean, they're waiting to bury a brother and they've lost another one. But I would say that there's a lot that we can draw from the loss. From the medical perspective, as a country, what can we learn from these experiences, and identify with what Dismas has said. do we have everything in place to ensure that, you know, medical emergency, you know, is exactly that, an emergency, something that can be expedited at the shortest time possible to try and save life. That is one. And then number two, I think, is the question of what can we learn from Magoha as a national leader, the inspiration that we draw from what he has done for this country, how he served President Uhuru Kenyatta diligently. And I think he has this very interesting distinction as a vice chancellor who is celebrated by students who are student leaders at the University of Nairobi when he was at the helm. I don't think that happens quite often, but it tells you that in leadership, what matters is the impact you have on the institutions that you're leading and the people. Make a big difference and you leave a legacy.
Right.
So I would say that there's a lot that we can draw from Magoha. At 71, I think he's probably gone too early, was still very energetic. And as a professor, there is a lot of knowledge, you know, that he had to impact the next generation of professors in medicine, which we have lost.
Dismas, when we looking at Professor Magoha's leadership style, he has been termed as stance, and there's no gray areas. It's black and white and very firm in his ways. And this report here, the devastating and sudden death of Professor Magoha, comes at a time when he had actually commissioned a book to document his achievements at the Education Ministry, where he had served for 3 years. It was as if he had a premonition that his time was nigh and that he needed to put down in writing his experiences and accomplishments in the education sector, where he did make a splendid record. Very also interesting is, talking to this writer last week, Professor Magoha intimated that he did not want to exit the scene without documenting his experiences, especially in managing the education sector under COVID-19 and implementing the competency-based curriculum, which became his pet subject.
Well, I guess MBA students will have a lot of content to study from the leadership of Professor Magoha and his leadership philosophy. But it appears to me that for him, his leadership was almost military style. That the moment your senior gives you instruction, you go and execute without asking instructions. You recall that any time President Kenyatta gave him instructions, he actually executed, and every single sentence he said that I'm in this role as CS for education because of President Kenyatta, and I'm going to follow instructions. The challenge with that is that if you get wrong instructions, then you know you've got the wrong agenda executed. But all in all, from everybody who's had a chance of saying anything about Professor Magoha, all of them are saying, I mean, positive things about him, and probably it's because of the African nature that when somebody has passed on, nobody will have the guts to say anything negative. But when you even speak to his colleagues, I mean, some professors from the University of Nairobi, they were very excited about his leadership and his capacity to deliver. But more important, he was a trusted friend. That he had a very small circle of friends, and they could take his word to the bank.
All right, and also joining us this morning, Jim India, political and governance analyst. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. Good morning. Good morning. And we are speaking of the untimely death of Professor George Magoha, and of course his leadership style. From where you sit, I don't know if you are a student of his at any point. You're quite young. I don't know what. So, I mean, what do you make of his leadership style?
I remember him at the University of Nairobi as the VC then, and how he dealt with students. And he was VC at a time where we had a very tough student leader at the University of Nairobi in Babu Owino back then. And they had a very, he had an interesting way of listening to students. He had an interesting way of taking up what students said. He had an interesting way of, you know, dealing with comrades' grievances, what we call comrades' grievances. And it was out here he looked very stern, but he was very political in the way he dealt with the students back then. Because at the end of the day, students can easily manipulate a vice chancellor in a whole administration. But he had a way of winning back the students. He put the university on a great track of progress and purpose. But beyond that, even in his time at the Education Ministry, I think he, as has been said by my panelists here, he was quite a stern human being and a stern persona.
Some called him the buffalo, right?
Some called him the buffalo.
Right.
I think his only flaw was that he could not dance. We remember some of his dance videos. That might have been his only flaw. But in terms of execution of duty, he did his best with what he had. So we do remember him greatly.
Right.
Yeah.
So the professor of medicine, as is famously known, arguably goes down as one of the most effective education ministers of all time, according to this report. And even with that, I mean, one of the biggest things that stands out from his tenure as the Education Cabinet Secretary and also the chair of the Kenya National Examination Council was a clamped down on runaway exam cheating that had made Kenya a laughingstock among the country of nations. He did so with vigor and fervor. But even with that, I mean, on the issue of the exams, something interesting is also happening here, and it's also part of what we have in the Daily Nation. And there you have it. Senate starts probe on fishy top grades. So this has been a conversation that has happened since the results of the KCSE were released. Now the Senate has launched investigations into claims of cheating in last year's Kenya Certificate of Secondary Education exams, whose results released last week had some schools suddenly posting many top grades. The Senate Education Committee chair confirming the probe amid the concerns that some schools recorded a sudden spike in the number of candidates scoring straight A's. Dismas, should we be happy as a nation that we're having more students score A, or should we be concerned that, wait, maybe there's something going on?
I think for some reasons, majority of Kenyans think that the purpose of examinations is to have people fail. So when you have a good number of people passing, then they start raising eyebrows and raising questions, sometimes which tend to be on the illogical and flimsy side. You know, I come from Kisii, and there's been jokes that maybe there's something happened in Kisii and Nyamira, where we've had a number of schools that in the past were not seen to be level 1, but they've come to rock the boat. And so it's very interesting that these senators actually think that when schools from a particular part of Kenya are demonstrating very high grades, then there is a mischief. You never hear of this conversation when it's the schools or parts of Kenya which are expected to do very well. But when there are new kids on the block, or when there are new schools rocking the boat, it
but they're calling it an abnormal curve, which again there's a lot of questions that have been raised even in the public with regard to the same.
Yeah, again, as an accountant, I'll say that these people are focusing on administration, and you've had new strategies. So the students have done much better than the prior students. However, this investigation is welcome, so that then people are able to establish the rumors, truths, facts, and propaganda. Because if we keep on going with this kind of narrative that probably the exams are not free, fair, nor credible, then there's a very high chance that this kind of conversation may cast aspersions on the quality of education in Kenya. So in my view, this probably is welcome, so that at the end of the day, they pronounce themselves, instead of people just relying on rumors and you know, propaganda for this kind of conversation. Because you can imagine the students from Kanotunga High School and Nyambaria and the rest, which have done very well. You can imagine how the parents are feeling, and the top students who probably had to place a lot of cold water in a karai and, you know, spend hours on end studying. And then you are a top student, and all of a sudden people are claiming, wait a minute, you assisted. And we know for a fact that in this examination, the way it was conducted, it was in the same level like, you know, the way people manufacture currency. There were a lot of security marks that it was practically impossible to steal the examination. And if maybe the examination was compromised, would you say that it was limited to 2 counties? And indeed, so it's important for relevant agencies to do a very thorough probe, and I doubt whether the Senate has got the capacity, but, you know, a very solid probe, so that, you know, Kenya produces human capital for the entire world. We don't want our, you know, in this era of globalization of production and marketing, for people to start casting aspersions on the integrity of the Kenyan exam. Okay,
Hezbon, I want to get your view on the same, but also I think a lot of questions that Kenyans were asking at that point when the results were released was how practical is it for a school to actually manage to get 100 A's?
Well, you know, let me speak as a teacher. When you're teaching a class, because the national exam is just, you know, more or less the same as just other evaluations that we have in school. And you release grades. There is something called grade moderation at the university level. Mm-hmm. And what happens is very simple. You can have an abnormal curve. It could be all students, you know, have average grades, stellar grades, or there is a dismal performance. And what normally happens is this an interrogation of how did we arrive at these grades. And if how we arrive at grades, if it is my class and all students have A- and A planes, and there's a due process. They did the continuous assessment, they did the coursework, they wrote their term papers, they did the final exams and the projects, and there is clear indication that the A's that they have is a reflection of their competence and the level of engagement they had in class, and they've acquired skills and knowledge. No one can question that. So the issue here is not that more Kenyans got A's at KCSE level, or schools all of a sudden are making the grades out of nowhere. The issue here is what is underneath all this. And I agree with this much, that we may want to interrogate and find out what changed in some of these schools, you know. But it still raises the question of, in 1 year, is that transformative change, you know, enough to move a school from a mean of 6 point something to a mean of 10, you know? And those are the critical questions that have to be asked. We cannot be a country where when our kids fail, we complain. When they pass, we complain. You see, and if that happens, it simply means that it is a system that has a problem. And one of the key reasons why we need to celebrate the likes of Professor Mago and Matiang'i is that they were very firm. They understood the country that we operated in. They knew that we have a system that is fairly shaky, and therefore you have to be very resolute in anything that you want to achieve. And I want to believe that they had laid the foundation for building a good system. So in case of what we have in these examinations, what I would say is very simple. That as a country, it's encouraging that we are seeing some progress in terms of performance. But the fact that we doubt those performance, the fact that we are not celebrating those A's, we are raising a number of questions. And some of the questions that are raised are very genuine. For instance, you have a school where everyone has scored an A in maths, or majority have an A in maths. But then in physics, they can hardly get C+. You know, there's a question mark there. Like, there's a positive correlation between the knowledge, the knowledge set and skills that you need for maths, which are relatively close to what you need for physics. So those are areas that need to be investigated just to establish what exactly happened. And, you know, not to condemn the students for the flaws, for the flaws that are systemic, you know, and endemic in our system. Deal with those flaws and ensure that next time you release the grades, if people have failed, we believe that these kids have actually performed dismally. And if they've passed, we appreciate that this is our effort and we have a system that can generate students who are competitive. You know, there is the issue of saying that we need more graduates from Kenya who have good grades, because we are supplying human capital to the entire world. You know, that is only as good as their competence when they go outside the world. Because if they go outside the world and they demonstrate to the world that they have these good degrees, these good grades, but they don't have the competence, then it will interfere with the reputation that we have there. And for the next generation, guys will be like, yeah, they come from Kenya, they have good grades, but they can't do nothing. But I would say that as someone who has taught at the university level for the last 12 years, there is something that is fundamentally, you know, not adding up. The level of understanding certain basic things, specifically English grammar at the university level, is one thing. And I can't blame the students. There is a way in which that transition from primary to high school also caused this. I was speaking to a number of English teachers from high school, and they were saying that these days, I think the numbers are just too big. By the time you give a composition, for you to mark for the entire class, or the array of classes that you're teaching, it's the end of the term. So that engagement, you know, with the teachers, the student-teacher ratio, is something that has to be looked into. Because if the instructional material is not delivered in a way that gives the student competence. And we live in a country where integrity is at its lowest level, where even parents help their children in KCSE to steal, where the community wants people to pass at all costs. So if the instructional material and the engagement between the students and the teachers is not sufficient to give them confidence, they will seek that confidence elsewhere. And with the technology that we have, I think it's just a question of, does that system ensure that there is integrity in the examination process?
Right.
Then, if I may buttress what Will has just indicated,
I'll take a break, right?
A member of the National Assembly yesterday on national TV indicated that some of his colleagues cannot structure sentences properly.
Right.
So we are talking of members of the National Assembly. And the same happens at the Senate. Of course, after he was challenged, they withdrew, but he gave a primary observation that there's a challenge. And as Will has indicated, majority of Kenyans have got challenges with engaging in a conversation in language for 10 minutes. He has just confirmed that. So maybe we need to start ourselves when did it start raining on us, so that we prepare human capital, not just for Kenya, but for the entire world, which is top of the range.
All right. And I'll come back to you, Jimmy, but we have to take a very quick break here on M Live. When we come back, we'll continue a bit on what's still in the dailies and then get to the matter of the conversation this morning, which is the Justice Agri Wuchelule Tribunal, which ended its hearing yesterday. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back.
Daring Abroad makes me dare. It's the only show of its kind in the world. And now, it's bigger.
And even more entertaining and informative than before.
Hapa kunaitwa Kakoe na inatubaba sana.
From London to Jersey Island.
Goma in the Democratic Republic of Congo to the scenic features of Uganda, the Pearl of Africa.
And many more places abroad and at home.
I watch Daring Abroad. I like the stories which people bring.
Daring Abroad every Saturday at 7:30 p.m. with repeats every Sunday at 1:30 p.m. on NTV.
A lot of diabetic patients are at a high risk of various health complications, but did you know that they are at an even higher risk, especially when it comes to cardiovascular diseases?
If you're not managing your sugars well, of course your other organs are going to strain. So then now developing what? A heart disease. Learn to listen to your body. It gives you an indication that this is not right.
All right, and you're watching M Live on NTV. Still looking at what's in the dailies. MPs splurge despite calls for austerity. Well, members of parliament are splurging millions of shillings in seminars at top hotels and overseas trips, casting doubt on their commitment to the government's austerity measures. And while members of the 349-strong National Assembly flew to Mombasa and are booked at a beach hotel for a week at taxpayers' expense, they have boycotted the induction workshop that took them there to protest delays and the disbursement of the constituency development funds, which means they are wasting the money. The MPs whose first order of business after election in last year's August election was to push for a pay rise in disregard of caps imposed by the salaries regulator are enjoying luxuries even as taxpayers are asked to tighten their belts. Jim, I mean, what do you make of this? So we have members of parliament there. We have a government that says we're in a tough economic situation, but it seems that not so tough for the honorable members of parliament.
The economy is always tough for the rest of us. Often we've seen new members of parliament, when a new house resumes, their first order of business is usually to ensure that they have a pay rise, increase their perks, and as you can see, they do not have the CDF kitty, because that is the main bone of contention. And the courts had struck it off and said, you know, this is unconstitutional. We cannot keep funding the county governments, but also funding at the constituency level. And at a time where majority of Kenyans are going through hard economic times and are barely affording to put food on their table, to buy basic commodities, to have spent about 5.6 million just for air tickets. We're not talking about the accommodation and how much that costs us as taxpayers. And then they are boycotting the whole process. It means we're wasting a lot of money in that process. And it's across the divide. This is now not just an issue of a particular. They are united on this. They do not get along on who won the presidency.
No political division.
But on this, they are speaking under one voice on how much they need and how much they need to be catered for. Now, to be fair to them, and I know a lot of Kenyans have said that CDF had a role that it was playing in many communities. A lot of children went to school courtesy of CDF. Roads here and there, some development here and there, police stations here and there, clinics were built courtesy of CDF. And so there needs to be a way of the administration figuring out, in the wake of the judgment by the Supreme Court, how do we then navigate and ensure that we are not denying the people, and ensuring that we are still able to, politicians and members of parliament are still able to play that role that they were playing, because it made them run away just from representation to actually they had a social role that they were playing. And I think that social role, which is not articulated in the Constitution, a social role of taking kids to school, it is not representation, it is not legislation, it is not oversight. It is actually taking care of those in society who cannot. How do we ensure the members of parliament, and even senators, that's one of the things that a lot of senators, there's a high turnover of senators every year, because the public feel that these guys are not working, because they're not playing that social role that is silent in the Constitution. So perhaps what would be best is for the National Assembly, the Parliamentary Service Commission, and all the different bodies, you know, the SRC, to figure out how do we still ensure that Kenyans get that, either through the county governments or through a provision that will be within the law, because you cannot go outside of the law.
Right. And Dismas, just last November, the National Treasury released a schedule showing the entire budget on foreign travel, training and other non-essential items that had been cut in President William Ruto's 300 billion austerity plan. And this was, you know, a plan to free up more cash for, you know, what we're talking about, critical projects in the country. But here we have the members of parliament, of course, you know, asking for more and more. Where do we as Kenyans stand? From
a human capital perspective, I would not complain when I see anybody going for an induction course, because when you get into a new role, you must have a capacity and competence to deliver. And in my view, cabinet secretaries need induction courses, especially the new ones the ones who are just coming to the public sector, for them to have those are soft or even hard skills for them to, to be suitable for that role. And the same applies to principal secretaries as well as members of the National Assembly, Senate, or even county assemblies. Because if you've just won an election, it's important for you to understand what is the role of a member of the National Assembly. You know, you may talk about the three responsibilities, but it's important to go deeper, because if they're not prepared for their roles, then our probability of successful delivery is going to be compromised. However, the bone of contention is around CDF and whether or not they're using the right procedures to make their case known. In my view, they should go ahead with the induction process, but get a better way of speaking with the National Treasury. And you know, they're saying the National Treasury, CS, had made a commitment that he was going to disburse resources. So actually, they want the National Treasury, CS, to live to his word, which in my view is important. That any public servant of rank, the moment you issue a statement and say, I'm going to deliver on some projects, you must deliver on that. So in my view, they're merely holding the CS of the National Treasury accountable. But the long-term solution to CDF, because majority of the members of the National Assembly, they're saying they want to use the resources to pay fees. Is it not possible for them to come up with a piece of legislation that would make it automatic for bright, needy students to just go to school without having to queue outside the CDF offices to get this bursary? Because when you look at the administrative costs of most of the funds we have in Kenya, because for CDF, there's an administration cost. All these funds have got an administration cost. Maybe there's room and there's an opportunity for them to come up with a piece of legislation to make these bursaries almost automatic. They can develop a very nice app where somebody enters basic details and they need the students to get resources without having to rely on the philanthropy or benevolence of the CDF accounts.
All right. Hasbun, even with the NGCDF issue aside, I mean, one of the biggest issues that has come out from this report, and perhaps many are questioning, is the austerity measures that the government is talking about versus what we're seeing. A lot of foreign trips, a lot of, well, Disma says the induction workshops and the trainings are necessary to equip these, members of parliament, even cabinet secretaries. But really, where do we, create that balance?
I think that's the tricky part, that whereas the executive can rein in on the bureaucratic side of government and guarantee these austerity measures, I think parliamentarians are totally different breed, totally different. I mean, the cost of just getting them to Mombasa in itself is speaking, nothing close to what austerity is, And I think that's a decision that the parliamentary leadership has to make and be decisive around. That if it's a government that is looking at cutting costs because of what is happening in Kenya, everyone is suffering. I mean, you look at what you used to do when you enter a supermarket 1 year ago and what you have to do today. There's actually, a Kenyan who is well respected outside there who kept saying that the moment you step out of the house, 3,000 is gone. So for you to, ensure there is austerity within your household, the only thing you can do is not step out. So, MPs also have to be alive to the hardships that Kenyans are going through. We cannot see money being flaunted left, right, and center. People are living in opulence. People are in high-end hotels, Yet, they are our representative. They ought to be doing something to show that as our representatives, they're also feeling the plight of Kenyans. And I think the first thing to do that is to take ownership of the fact that they have to cut down their expenses. But then coming back to NGCDF, I'm a big fan of NGCDF. Mm-hmm. I've done a serious study on NGCDF. And enough times guys say that if CDF is good, then it should not be in the hands of MPs. That if CDF is good, then it needs to be legislated. And my take is very simple, that if there is anyone to legislate and have a legislative framework that allows CDF to thrive, it is still the members of parliament. Mm-hmm. So with the pronouncements from the court and this idea of did it invalidate the NGCDF Act of 2015 or the earlier act, and if it is the invalidation of the earlier act, mm-hmm. does it automatically vacate the NGCDF Act of 2015? Those are very critical conversations and a framework that can, just help MPs have clarity mm-hmm. on what the law is and how CDF has to be dispensed. Because we cannot have CDF in place and then it is also at the whims of the executive to decide when they are releasing it. So when MPs, stall the House business, say that they're not going to transact anything in Parliament, then Treasury releases money. There has to be a way. There has to be a way of ensuring that if this money is going to bridge the national government development gap at the lowest level, which they consider to be the constituency, there has to be a way to ensure that that money can be released, whether MPs like it or not, and MPs cannot hold anyone hostage because that money has not been released.
All right. All right, but before we take a look at this story, I want us to view. This is what we have on the Business Daily. IMF is now projecting Ethiopia, Angola economies to overtake Kenya. Now, Kenya is set to be replaced as the third largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa by Angola and Ethiopia, weakening the East African country's power to tap investors enticed with a population that has now more cash to spend, which means faster GDP growth in Angola and Ethiopia will see Kenya relegated to number 5 in sub-Saharan Africa's economies rankings, and this is according to the projections by the International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, that also shows Nigeria as the largest economy on the continent. So this is a very interesting report here, which now shows Kenya has been relegated to 5th largest economy in Africa, Nairobi weakening in race for wealthy foreign investors. I don't know, what do you make of that very quickly before we move on to that report? Maybe Jim, I mean, when you're looking at that, what does this portend for us as a nation, economically speaking?
Obviously, IMF rankings and ratings are good for the global market because they sort of determine where certain countries put their money. Remember that Kenya is now considered a middle-income economy. It's not considered a low-income economy, and because of that, there are certain fundings that we are not getting by that status. But if you look at, for instance, Ethiopia and Angola, they're saying they're having a faster GDP growth. Now, the conversation that most Kenyans have always had is we don't eat GDP for breakfast and supper. So what we eat is per capita. So if we can increase our per capita, a majority of Kenyans don't really care whether we are number 1 or number 5. Ordinary Kenyans do not care about that. What they care about is, do I have enough money in the pocket? But from a trade point of view, it is important on where you're positioned, because that determines foreign investment that's coming into your economy. It determines how many of the Microsofts and the rest of them are coming to set up shop in your countries. We've had a lot of the tech startups coming to Kenya to set up here. But as this changes, a lot of them are now shifting and going to Rwanda and going to Nigeria. So perhaps we need to look at our tax conditions, because there's a way around it. There's a way around it to say, okay, if you're being relegated from a GDP standpoint, how do you make our economy lucrative for foreign direct investment? And that is through taxation. And how do we ensure that we are not putting punitive taxes on foreign investors and as such pushing them out of the country? We've had massive redundancies declared at the end of last year by a majority of the startups here in the country. And a lot of them cite difficult economic times, high tax rates in this country, and difficult working conditions per se. So there is, the IMF projections are devastating in the fact that they make us less lucrative to invest in, but there's a way through legislation that we can still go around it and ensure that we are still lucrative to do business.
Right, yes, this must...
You know, when you look at the economies which are said to be superior to Kenya, when you look at Nigeria and Angola, the common denominator is oil. Kenya doesn't have oil. And when you look at Ethiopia, is the population. So if I was somebody in charge of taking policy decisions in Kenya, I wouldn't be worried about these reports, because there's nothing Kenya can do to have oil like Angola or Nigeria, although there's something around oil in Turkana. It's a puzzle, and also Ethiopia has got numbers. However, I've seen that President Ruto has activated his interest in positioning Kenya as an FDI destination. In fact, the Prime Cabinet Secretary, Musalia Mudavadi, has taken that as one of his sole responsibilities and priorities. It's very easy to promote Kenya as an FDI destination and use Kenya as a stepping stone to the entire region, to the COMESA bloc, to the East African Community bloc. And as Will had indicated earlier on, what are some of the advantages you have in this region? It's about human capital. So if you can just work on human capital and ask ourselves, what can we do to make sure that Kenya is attractive for international investors? Number one, we position ourselves for human capital, and then we become an outsourcing facility. Like, for instance, you remember the other day we were saying that for the aviation sector, Morocco has got about 54 subcontractors. Why can't we do the same in Kenya? Why would anybody who has got a chopper in Kenya, or in fact a plane, take it to Uganda for servicing? Why can't we look at our fiscal regime? Why can't we look at our taxation regime and human capital regime so that we become an attraction? And to his credit, President Kenyatta invested a lot of resources in the KDF. Now they're doing shipbuilding and repair. Why can't we make a lot more noise about that, so that our neighbors, instead of going to maybe Europe, they do it in Kenya? What about medical tourism? We've got a lot of investments in medical tourism. What are we doing to attract people to come to Kenya? So for me, I wouldn't be worried about Angola and Nigeria. We can't do anything around oil. But for Ethiopia, maybe there's something we can do around population. We can multiply numbers. But at the end of the day, still it's on the government to position Kenya as an FDI destination.
All right. Hezbon, you want to make a comment very quickly on this, then we move forward?
Yeah, well, for me, I think we need to be worried. I mean, we need to be worried because we had a very significant economic growth,
right.
But at some point we sort of stagnated, or the rate at which we were growing sort of slowed down. And the only thing that I pick from this is our politics has to make our economy work. That's what it is. I mean, the reason why, yes, Ethiopia, Angolan economies are overtaking us. The reason why Tanzania is now growing faster than we are doing is simply because of our politics. Look at what is happening to Nairobi. It is weakening the race for wealthy investors. And I agree with Dismas that the opportunity that this government has to change things within a short turnaround time is foreign direct investments. So when you have certain utterances, certain political statements that are made with reckless abandon, with no recourse to what consequences they have on the economy, what we are doing is we are interfering with the extent to which we can attract this foreign direct investment. And that takes you back to the conversation around Nairobi and who owns Nairobi. And if Sakaja has to make Nairobi work, then Sakaja was given that mandate to make Nairobi work. So when you have politicians come in and make noise about Nairobi belongs to a certain, ethnic community, if you make a capital city a function of what an ethnic community wants that capital city to do and look like, how will it attract foreign investors?
So that's a good.
Also, Zainab, I think we, as Africans, we must read IMF reports with a pinch of doubt. IMF does not have a track record of being pro African people.
Right.
And so in whose interest is it that they do these rankings? Africans are not represented in a lot of those tables. And so I'm not saying they're wrong, but we must just read it with a pinch of doubt.
All right, gentlemen, let's move into a report here that was filed by Ibrahim Karanja yesterday. Now, immediate former IBC chairperson Wafula Chebukati has told the tribunal hearing the removal of Commissioner Irene Masit from the office, that the besieged commissioner, together with 3 others who have since resigned, agreed to a request to manipulate the presidential election results in favor of Raila Odinga. Well, in the last day of hearings against Masit, the former IBC chair gave a blow-by-blow account of how the events unfolded at the commission from the time when the Cherera 4 were brought on board to the point of the boardroom rupture. He reiterated the need for a commission of inquiry to establish the happenings. Let's take a look at that report.
Wanyonyi Wafula Chebukati was the 11th and last witness to testify against Commissioner Irene Masit before the Justice Agri Muchelule-led tribunal, and he says other than the difference witnessed on the 15th of August 2022, there had never been any disputes amongst the commissioners for the period in which they worked together, and more importantly, no disagreement was noted over the mode of result transmission.
Did anyone raise, especially the Commissioner Masit, raise any issue?
There was no issue raised by Commissioner Masit on any of the results that were announced.
In terms of the forms, the way the forms were filled, the validity of the forms, especially 34C, was there any challenge, any issues raised by Commissioner Irene Masit?
None whatsoever. The statement of the results being opaque, in my view, was totally dishonest. Commissioners were part and parcel of the results, verification and tallying, and I believe we ran the most transparent election ever in the history of this country.
Chebukati stating that he had involved each commissioner in the goings-on at the commission, and that the only difference witnessed was between Commissioners Francis Wanderi and Irene Masit, who for some reason could not work together.
Actually nominated Irene Masit to be the chair of Leadership and Integrity Committee of the IBC. Remember that?
Yes, I did.
You also made her a member of Electoral Code of Conduct.
Yes.
You also made her a member of Recruitment Panel of the Commission.
Yes.
Yes. He also made her a member of the Dispute Resolution Committee.
Yes.
At least you better sit in 9-10 committees.
Yes.
Surely that cannot be a person who is incompetent by any stretch of imagination.
We can say In terms of the commission operations, we worked very well. As up to that point.
While explaining that two teams, including the National Security Advisory Council, sought to have the results manipulated in favor of Raila Odinga, he mentioned that there was a promise of a hefty reward and that the Terera 4 commissioners agreed to the request.
We had also Honorable Tuchu spoke. He said that it was necessary that we moderate these results in favor of Baba, and that any contrary declaration of results would plunge the country into chaos. That we consider the request, then we shall be rewarded.
You shall be rewarded?
Yes.
Did he expound the reward?
We did not encourage him to expound the reward.
Earlier, the tribunal rejected a request by Azimio la Umoja One Kenya Coalition to be enjoined in its proceedings.
We do not find that a basis has been laid for us to introduce Azimio la Umoja One Kenya Alliance Party into these proceedings.
Masit's lawyer, Donald Kipkorir, had also accused members of the tribunal of being biased owing to previous connections with the UDA party and or President William Ruto.
So I'm asking Mr. Chairman that if there is suspicion by the public that Ms. Daudi, Linda, Peter, Emmanuel will be biased against my client, because there's evidence from yesterday is that Ms. Irene Masit wanted to stop President William Ruto from being president. There's a great danger, Mr. Chairman.
With 11 witnesses having testified, the tribunal has now concluded its hearings, with Masit not calling any witness to her defense. The team will reconvene on the 9th of February 2023 for final submissions from councils of both parties on whether or not recommending for Masit's removal will be necessary. President William Ruto is bound by the tribunal's decision and must implement its recommendation. Ibrahim Karanja, NTV.
All right, and you can find that report also on the Daily Nation. Chebukati tells of Tuju 3am visit, Security Council threat. The former IBC chair claims Azimio Executive Director promised monetary reward. Dismas, let me start with you. So the final hearing process ended yesterday at the tribunal, and the councils will be making their submissions on the 9th of February, and then after that they will retreat to come up with a ruling or an outcome from this hearing. What is your view of Chebukati's statements yesterday, and some would call it revelations to the public since he left office?
Well, I think you have to take what Mr. Chebukati said yesterday in context of the presidential election, as well as the petition at the Supreme Court. Now, what Mr. Chebukati said yesterday, and what he kept on repeating yesterday, is a source of concern for any Kenyan. And in my view, the revelations constitute a threat to national security. Because indeed, if Commissioner Masit wanted to do what Mr. Chebukati said yesterday, and what he had said in sworn affidavits at the Supreme Court, that is a threat to national security. Actions would have compromised Kenya's going concern, and would have invalidated Mora's will. In fact, it rubbishes the reason why people vote, because when Mora goes to cast her ballot, she wants to vote in a specific candidate. Having performed her duty, then you have the people managing the electoral process saying, wait a minute, we are going to frustrate Mora's will, and as members of a government committee, we are going to determine the winner. That is unacceptable, and it serves several things. Kenyans may lose faith in the voting process, so they will stop voting. And in fact, Azimio is already indicating that if you don't have fundamental reforms, then there's no need to participate in elections in 2027. That the outcome has already been predetermined. So, and you see, Mr. Chebukati is making these revelations in very small tranches, because this is around merely one commissioner. In my view, President Ruto must proactively consider establishing a commission of inquiry to look at the circumstances at Bomas, because very powerful names have been mentioned. People in the defense, people in security, people in the intelligence, who've been accused by Mr. Chebukati and the company of attempting to frustrate the will of Muraya. So we need a commission which will serve several things. Just make revelations for Kenyans really to understand. When we saw that choir from, I think, Tanzania, bellowing very melodious songs, what was happening in the background?
Right.
Indeed, is it true that people visited Mr. Chebukati and offered him a monetary reward? That there is a quid pro quo, that please moderate these results and in exchange we'll give you some money. Now, if what Mr. Chebukati is saying is actually a true reflection of what happened, what would have happened had he accepted to take this money? However, I mean, they have not disclosed the amount, but what would have happened had he decided to take the money? It could be probably set a precedent that the highest paying job in Kenya is to be an IBC commissioner, that when you're about to declare the results, call the two leading candidates and place your request on the table, then you will dance to the bank. So we need to have that revelation to know exactly what happened. Then number two, this will serve as a manual for anybody who is going to apply for a role at IBC. They'll know the do's and they will know the don'ts. Because right now it seems that the IBC commissioners, in as much as Wafula said there is a corporate governance manual, it seems they don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They're just jumping all over like popcorn in a prime fan, that you are taken to this committee, hospitality, you are taken to this committee for security. They really don't know what to do. But at the end of the day, we need to have pecuniary penalties and the criminal penalties for anybody who attempts to frustrate the will of Muraya. And from what Chebukati has indicated, had this succumbed to what this committee was saying, then the entire presidential election would have just been rubbished.
Hesbon, let me get your view first of all on the entire process. I don't know if you've been following the tribunal from the beginning. What do you make of most of these revelations, especially by Chebukati?
Well, I think there's nothing new that Chebukati is telling us, because if you revisit the affidavits that he signed during the entire Supreme Court process, they're more or less the same. And essentially what is coming out of this tribunal is poking a number of holes in the underbellies of both IBC and Chebukati. You listen to the interrogations that were fielded when Professor Abdi Guliye was presenting his submissions to the tribunal. You could actually tell that there's a lot that happened during the entire process, and the only way to know, because as it is right now, what we are seeing in the public domain is a story of the victor, the person who won the war, the battle. So the war is not complete, but the first battle, we can actually tell that when we went to the Supreme Court, Chebukati was between two major outcomes: either become a hero or a villain. Only those two options, because whichever direction that ruling was going to go, there were going to be consequences to Chebukati. Lucky for him, or because of the due process and the evidence that was adduced in course in the Supreme Court, he emerged the hero. So we are listening to the story of a hero, and therefore it is only going to be a romanticized story. The good deeds of the hero. He stopped this country from the brink. But the critical question we need to ask ourselves: if Chebukati was approached by people who wanted to compromise the will of Kenyans, and the allegations that are made right now is that if Raila was not going to be declared the president, there was going to be chaos in this country. We need to ask ourselves, Raila was not declared the president. Was there chaos? And if there was no chaos, why are we celebrating Chebukati and not Kenyans? It is Kenyans who rose beyond the partisan interest of politicians and decided that the will of the people has been expressed by the person we gave the mandate to determine this will. You see, so to that extent, Chebukati did his job, but it is Kenyans who rose beyond, a premonition that was for stalling something that was not good for this country. It never happened.
But
So
you
it-
must agree that with Chebukati's statements with regard to exactly what happened at the Bomas of Kenya right before the election results were announced, that there's certainly much to be, you know, opened so that Kenyans can be able to know
Thank
what
you.
kind of politics that we have
That's
in
the
the
point,
country.
and that's the point I'm coming to. You see, we will listen to Chebukati, the tribunal, and we'll end that story there. That's a romanticized story of the victor. But the truth of the matter can only be understood through a robust commission of inquiry that will even make recommendations that these are the people who wanted to frustrate the will of Kenyans. This is the evidence. You know, waking up and saying that they came, they wanted to compromise the process. We may need to ask ourselves, and these are very critical questions that all Kenyans may want to focus on. Now, you have a regime in place, a regime that was on the brink of winning. And then you have dark forces that wanted to go away with their win. That is one. Then number two, you have dark forces that wanted to assassinate Chebukati. Number three, you have people who came with a lot of money that wanted to compromise the IEBC commissioners. In what form did they carry that money? You know, those are questions that you're not hearing in this tribunal. Those are questions that in a robust commission, now we'll get to understand. So what was this reward that was promised? Because we've had these allegations of, you know, money exchanging hands, time above numbers in this country. Once and for all, we need to sort that. If a regime was on the brink of losing their victory like that and then they got power, I don't think the most prudent thing to do would be to make noise in public. I mean, they have the reins of power. Why can't they then act? Who is this who wanted to assassinate Chebukati? Who is this who was responsible for compromising the will of Kenyans? And if we have to do all this, then we have to revisit everything else that has happened. And by the way, if you're talking about Chebukati in the public domain, we also need to put ourselves in this space where we are critical. Why were we even in that space where the Form 34C to date, by therefore, I mean, this thing of guys saying that everything was in the public domain, there was a portal. There is a form in which that Form 34C is supposed to appear, and it is enshrined in the Constitution. We've never seen it today, and we had the proceedings there. I mean, Professor Gulia couldn't even answer that question. He couldn't, you know. Chebukati has not even attempted to talk about that. So there is a lot to this. We have a president in place. I mean, it's a symbol of national unity. There is need to understand what really happened. Let us not celebrate Chebukati. There is absolutely nothing he has added in our electoral process. Whatever we had in 2007, 2008 happened in 2022. It is only that Kenyans rose beyond political divisive talks and decided the will of the people has been expressed by the person who gave the mandate. But we need to revisit. If there was any contribution that this commission would have made to our democracy, they would have made a contribution that would have given us a predictable system that is not going to give us...
But Hezbollah, wouldn't the contribution also be the integrity that Chebukati holds when he says, I was not bribed and I stood with the people?
But you see, that is the story of the victor. That is the story of the victor. Wait. How do we know that he was not bribed? And how do we know that he made a contribution by declaring one? He was going to declare someone anyway, you see, and he was going to declare the winner. The question we need to ask ourselves as a country, is it that every 5 years we'll be on the brink, waiting, yeah, who is going to be declared, who is going to bribe who? You know, that is a contribution that IBC ought to have made. I mean, this is the first IBC that has left office after serving a successful term, but with absolutely no meaningful contribution.
Let's hear from Jim and then Dismas. Yeah.
And the issue here is if he could have been bribed, so he's already saying that someone offered him a bribe.
Right.
We do not know if, so there's one side that was very active trying to bribe, trying to influence, and then we're saying that there was another side that was quiet, calm and collected, that did not care about the outcome and were praying to God and hoping that all works out well. But the issue here is constantly we change individuals. We had Isaac Hassan, then we brought in Chebukati. Constantly we change individuals and hope that some way, miraculously, the system would change. We hope that somehow Chebukati will change the system. But the truth of the matter is, no matter who we put in that position, and I remember last time names were mentioned, no matter if today they gave you or me that position. The systemic nature of the IEBC, the politics around the IEBC, the economy around the IEBC is such that it will not thrive. And every time and again, there will always be issues raised around the integrity of these elections. Because if we cannot resolutely, as a people, agree on who a winner of an election is, we cannot, as a people, agree that this election was, we cannot verify who won. We cannot authenticate the win of any individual in this country at any given time. Always, we are trying to figure things out at the Supreme Court, because this election ultimately was decided at the Supreme Court. The people of Kenya did vote, the IBC did their account, but there were questions that were raised around those matters. And the Supreme Court had to intervene as prescribed. Like our constitution anticipated that we'd get to this point where we cannot agree as a people, and the Supreme Court would decide for us. Twice that has happened. Now, Wafula Chebukati, who today we are hailing as a man of integrity, and I wish that he is. I pray that he is. I do not know, but I pray that he is those things that he says in this election. But let's not forget that in 2017, the things that he plunged us into. Let's not forget that an entire election that we spent billions of taxpayers' money was nullified because of him. Him and around 3 other commissioners were the ones in office at that time. That election was nullified, and we had to go for a repeat election, which was boycotted, and again spent millions of shillings around it. The integrity of that election, we have never set up a tribunal for it. We have never done a commission of inquiry for it. And so if we want to be consistent as a country and say that we actually want the truth behind what happens in our elections, then we need to dial back, at least for this one commission that is exiting office, and do an audit of their term in office. What have they achieved? What happened in 2017 and what happened in 2022? Because the Supreme Court gave very clear recommendations in 2017. The Supreme Court equally gave very clear recommendations in 2022. Now we've set up a tribunal, and we're hoping to get into a commission of inquiry and do another round of recommendations. What happens to what the Supreme Court said, which actually hold us because they are legally binding to us? So I think that the entire thing is a smokescreen. I think the entire thing is meant to keep the country on their toes, and that's why you saw Baba come in and is keeping us on our toes. And for the next 1 year, this is going to be the conversation we'll have.
So what, this must just political, what we're seeing, is it just a political gimmick?
Well, you know, we went to the polls, and registered voters showed up. They cast their ballots, and IBC made a declaration. And IBC says the entire process was anchored by the Maina Kiai ruling and the Supreme Court ruling and judgments, the prior rulings. And then one of the parties was unhappy about the declaration and went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court audited the presidential election and validated the win of President Ruto. So I don't know whether there is any other person who has a capacity to cast aspersions on what the Supreme Court did. Because when you go to the Supreme Court and you say that somebody has stolen my cow or a goat, then it's incumbent on you to deliver your solid evidence. And you remember the judges said that it was some funny descriptions. So I don't know whether there is anybody in Kenya who can go to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro or Mount Kenya and say that the Supreme Court was compromised. In fact, Mr. Raila Odinga blames everybody apart from himself for his failure to become president. He blames IBC and he blames the Supreme Court. But if you go back to history, he blames President Moi, he blames President Kibaki, he blames President Kenyatta. No, wait a minute. Let us just focus. No, calm down. And then he blames President Ruto. And he goes to the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court has found substantive evidence, they've nullified the election, as they did in 2017. Okay. And when they found what error, they'll pronounce themselves as much. But before you close on that,
we have to take a break. But husband has asked a question. Is it about the individual or the election process that we're talking about?
You know, we're talking about Kenya, where some individuals tend to be more powerful than systems. And you know, this thing is not limited to Kenya. We have seen it in the US with Donald Trump, and we have seen it in Brazil. You remember what happened in Brazil a few days ago. And we are all agreed we must have a commission of inquiry so that anybody with liability faces criminal penalties and pecuniary penalties. But right now, as we have this conversation, Tell me if there's anybody behind bars for flouting the electoral rules in Kenya. If there's nobody behind bars before we approach the next election, then people will break the electoral rules with impunity because they know at worst they're going to be kicked out of office or they'll be mentioned in public.
Okay.
But you see,
husband, I want you to hold
1 minute,
we have
because
to really
this
take
has
a break because we've run out
contradicted
of time.
himself. Dismas is
10
saying,
seconds.
Dismas is saying that no one has been thrown behind bars. But the same IBC and the political formation that won is actually pointing accusing fingers at forces that we don't know. They have the reins of power. Then it is incumbent upon them to ensure that the very, very people and forces that try to compromise the will of Kenyans are dealt with.
So is the contradiction?
Wait. The contradiction is he wants them to be dealt with, yeah? But the same people are being mentioned, but no one is telling us who they are, but by the people who hold the reins of power.
All right.
So, you see, this is a smoke screen. That, you know, there's a way in which they're trying to make it appear like they want a commission of inquiry, but the reality is they just want to wish some of these things away.
I want you to hold on to that.
It's not about who won or who did not win. Kenyans want a situation where we go to an election goes, someone is declared, people go home.
Okay. I just want you to hold on to that thought. I know I've rushed you there, but we're going to come back and continue with this conversation. We really have to take that break. The hashtag we're using this morning, MLiveNTV, at Zainab Ismail, at NTV Kenya. Stay with us in just a few moments. We'll be back.
National Cancer Institute of Kenya and partners invites you to join us from 2nd to 4th February at the Kasarani Primary School, where screening will be done and the public will be educated on cancer and its associated risks. The National Cancer Summit will be taking place at the same time from 2nd to 3rd at the Safari Park Hotel, where health experts will show and share best practices. Wondering how you can acquire a home affordably along the Thika Superhighway? Centum Real Estate brings to you 265 Elma 1 Apartments, the newest and most stylish development in Kasarani. The project is located 3 kilometers from the Thika Superhighway. The gated estate has a usable roof terrace to the apartment blocks, a mini soccer pitch, a mini tennis court, a convenience retail center, ample parking, treated 24/7 water, power backup, and a green courtyard. The homes are priced from 2.5 million Kenya shillings. Pay a deposit of 250,000 Kenya shillings and the balance in flexible installments or mortgage financed. You can now own one of these homes. We have a limited number of studios, 1-bed and 2-bedroom apartments remaining. Talk to us today on 0712 000 265 or text Elma to 22365. Data Protection Fact Sheet Mandate. 1. Regulate the processing of personal data, and 2. Ensure that the processing of personal data of a data subject is guided by the principles set out in Section 25 of the Act.
Join the ODPC as we commemorate Data Privacy Day on the 27th of January from 8 a.m. at the Kenyatta International Convention Center under the theme Promoting Data Protection in Digitally Transformed Economy.
With Glovo, you have anything you want from your city in your hands. Kama unatamani ugali beef ama fried chicken, order Glovo ujaribu restaurant mpya. Tamu. Kama game inawaka na unataka drinks zaidi, order Glovo ushangilie timu yako. Na kama your little one amemess na diapers zimeisha, order Glovo and save the day. With Glovo, unaweza track order yako na kuongea na customer support, which is always available. Download the app and order anything you want from your city. We'll deliver.
The proud reputation of Juventus was forever tarnished by the 2006 Calciopoli scandal. So there should be a similar sense of shame for those responsible for the latest scandal that has delivered harsh punishments, not least of all to the team. For Setien, football is not all about winning and losing. as much as it is about how you play the game and staying true to that vision.
It's the headquarters of good vibes. So I should just kneel and begin to call on Jesus because I'm a bishop.
You know, Dr. Kingori, yes, you sound like a street fighter. Where did you grab it? Unataka noma.
Kingori, let me tell you something. Mimi mtu angenipata saa hiyo nikiwa first year. Angeangukia bibi mzuri.
You know, they always say smart women, where to catch them is with love.
Kingori, I love how your suit looks. I love you in a suit. I love you in a t-shirt.
As in any example, you actually mean that. Maifungua akili ya msee ama kichwa ya msee ukapata vile watu husema huyu jamaa ana akili.
Tunaweza toa nyama kwa huko nyuma tuweke kwa
kifua. Sisi mtu anakuwa na roho chafu sana. Na ukidive inahesabiwa?
Yes, ndio ukiwin, udive win si umewin.
Hiyo ndio tizi unafaa upige. Napiganga tu tizi ya 90 meters ya kwanza, alafu nikifika 90 meters ina fly. Every Friday on NTV 7:30 p.m.
Want to know the biggest story of the week? Do not worry. The Weekly Review has got you covered for in-depth analysis of politics, business, governance, as well as social issues. The Weekly Review covers it all. For well-researched, exclusive and investigative content, read the Weekly Review every Sunday on Nation e-paper and on www.nation.africa, free of charge.
All right, welcome back. Thank you for staying with us. You're watching AM Live. Now, the political landscape in the country is once shifting again to a rather too familiar situation. Accusations and counter-accusations are being traded between the winners and losers of the 2022 presidential election. Now, this time pitting President William Ruto against Raila Odinga, who is once again protesting what he terms as a fraudulent election, threatening to invoke mass action against the government. What could be his end game this time around? Well, is it another handshake in the offing? And TV's Sydney Chazima explodes. Let's take a look at that report when we come back and have that conversation.
Raila Odinga's recent utterances during the rally at the Kamukunji grounds appear to have unsettled the equilibrium in the country's political sphere. President Ruto has laughed off Odinga's utterances, alluding to the fact that this would not be the first time Odinga has marshaled his supporters against a sitting government.
My friends, si hata mubadilishe tactic kidogo. Sasa ile ya zamani mnaendelea tu naye.
Wameitisha mimi ati jamani watu ambao wanapenda mambo ya kufanya maandamano.
Political pundits opine that Odinga is right within his political playbook.
The political playbook that made NDP and KANU to work together under the government of former President Moi, the same playbook that made him work with Mwai Kibaki, the very same old notes in the Raila Odinga political playbook that made him work with Uhuru Kenyatta.
Admittedly, Raila's onslaught against the Kenya Kwanza government appears to have received the necessary momentum from the anonymous IEBC whistleblower claims that he won the election.
Now, Raila Odinga is sure, is aware that he lost the election. If at all Raila Odinga is willing and ready to believe and swallow that content from an unknown, nondescript whistleblower, then I think Raila Odinga is curiously joking with the intelligence of Kenyans, and in fact he is making a mockery of his very own assertions by way of the evidence that he produced to the Supreme Court.
Talk of Raila using the same script, punctuated with mass action, to push for a power-sharing deal has not escaped Ruto's ears.
Sasa mnafikiri mnaweza kunipangia mimi ati maandamano? Ati mpate chochote kutoka kwangu? You are dreaming.
Nasema hapa leo sitaki mambo ya handshake.
By denying the ploy for a handshake, Odinga is wary of a repeat of the political ramifications brought about by the 2018 handshake between him and Uhuru Kenyatta.
Very many people were angry with Raila because of the handshake. It is a testimony of his political genius that he managed to bring back into the fold a lot of those people. He still couldn't get others. The young men in my place, Western, who supported Hustler, said they are doing so because Raila disappointed them.
The 2018 handshake led to the infamous Uhuru fallout. Ruto's deputy, Rigathi Gachagua, and other leaders at the top echelons of the Kenya Kwanza administration remain alive to the fact that a Ruto-Raila handshake would throw them down the pecking order.
Sasa ati analete fujo, ndio wanaongea pale, nimetumiwa message. Ati anataka ati aingie kwa hii serikali ya huyu rais wetu. Si rais wako hapa. Mungetaka tumkaribishe ama aende akiendaga.
Old men and young people share something which they have in common. They can be reckless. And Mutahi Ngunyi quoted and told Ruto, never play with a guy who has nothing to lose.
Aside from the handshake claims, Raila appears to be moving with speed to reconsolidate his Azimio base, with some Jubilee leaders now warming up to Ruto.
They should not rejoice if they take leaders from Raila's side. But what are the consequences? Is if you isolate Raila, then he becomes a dangerous animal. What does he do? He takes his case direct to the people of Kenya.
Closing arguments from pundits have not ruled out possibilities of a truce between Ruto and Raila.
If at all there will have to be a handshake, that handshake will not be orchestrated by Raila Odinga. It will be orchestrated by the circumstances beyond the control of President William Ruto and Raila Odinga himself.
Sydney Chazima, NTV.
Let me begin with you, Jim. So now we have Raila Odinga, who jetted back into the country straight to Kamukunji and protesting what he says is the election was not credible and that the president did not win the election. Of course, we've seen this, the sentiments and the statements being made a couple of, weeks after the election. Things seemed to settle down a little bit, but now it seems we're full throttle back into this, dark shadow that continues to hang over our heads as a nation from the aftermath of the 2022 presidential election. Where do we go from now? Because as a country, it seems like we cannot move forward unless we settle this issue.
So one of the things that happened, a lot of the Azimio leaders said after the Supreme Court pronounced itself, they said, we accept, but we don't agree. And I think that is a powerful statement. They're saying, we accept what the courts have said, and so the swearing in will continue and all that, but we do not agree with the Supreme Court. So essentially, they did not agree with the Supreme Court on the fact that they lost an election. And Raila, now there's this anonymous whistleblower who is now taking, it's now, we have two whistleblowers. We have one who we know, which is Chebukati. And we have an anonymous one who is now telling us and giving us figures from God knows where, and telling us that Raila won by whatever number of votes. And Raila, the timing of the whistleblower was also interesting, that it was just the day before Raila jetted into the country, and he went out and he told his people that we reject this government and we are going to take action. Of course, he left the people puzzled by what is this action. He did not say what exactly the action will be, but said on Sunday he's going back to Jacaranda Stadium and they're going to speak again on what the next action is. Remember in 2017, after Raila took oath of office illegally at Uhuru Park, Musalia Mudavadi isolated him, Kalonzo Musyoka isolated, all the leaders isolated him, and he was left alone. And a few weeks or months later, he found himself with President Uhuru Kenyatta. We did not know how that happened, but they did a handshake. This time round, and that time he had gone to the people. He was holding the People's Assembly, if you remember. There was the People's Assembly, and he was going around the country and talking to the people. And, people had started conversing around, this marriage is not working for us. This time round, he's going to do the same thing. He started out at Kamukunji, he's going to Jacaranda, I'm sure he's going to Mombasa, every other pit stop, and his conversation will be the same. Our victory, we were robbed and denied our victory, and so now we need to take action. What does he want? I read everything that he said, but there's just one thing, in my opinion, that he's interested in. It is a fact that Ruto is president. It is a fact that not unless some act of God happens, then he will not be president. But it is a fact he's president. It is a fact that the next election is in 2027, and Raila is fully aware of that. But there's a little matter of the reconstitution of the IEBC, in my opinion, that seems to be of interest to the Azimio leader. You remember in 2013, that was his interest as well, where they needed to reconstitute the Isaac Hassan Commission and brought in Chebukati. As I had said earlier, the economy around the IEBC is such that you must be part of who is in the IEBC for you to win an election. Unfortunately, that's where we've got into. And if Raila Odinga and the opposition is not part of reconstituting that commission, then in their opinion, the president automatically wins the next election. And so they have to do everything within their power to ensure that they are invited to the table and that they get to a formula that allows both parties to have people in that commission who are favorable in their eyes. And so for me, this entire conversation is going to rotate around the reconstitution of the IEBC. Nobody is interested in becoming president. Raila is not interested. Okay. He knows he will not be president, but he's very much interested on who forms the next commission. Okay, Hezbon, let me get to you.
Well, even me, I want to believe that the biggest issue that Kenyans should focus on in all these political conversations in the public domain is how do we, going forward, have an electoral process that is just, a just electoral process, the one that we can vote, go back at home and say whoever will be declared, that is the person who gave the most of our votes. But I think coming back to what is happening, and I've listened to colleagues, including Javas Bigambo, talk about, Raila is doing things the traditional way. And I think for once as Kenyans, we may want to, divorce some of these conversations from the political, figures around this conversation and look at the real issues. So is it Raila doing things the same way, or is it Kenyans doing things the same way? I looked at that crowd and I asked myself, this is January. We have a lot of issues going on. On a Monday morning. And these are Kenyans who have come out. And you see, politicians across the political divide have made it clear, unequivocally clear, that the only politician who can draw people into a public baraza or assembly without mobilization is Raila Odinga. So we may want to ask ourselves, what is this that is driving people to come and listen to Raila? And then number two, what is this issue that is being discussed by the political leadership that is bringing people to listen? And if these issues are issues that we are supposed to exercise our minds on, then we need to exercise our minds on these issues without any political recourse and ask ourselves, is this the space where we want to find ourselves? And there are two issues, by the way. One is the issue of election, because there is an anonymous whistleblower, you see, and we are going to say that this is the loser's story. They're telling their story that they lost an election. And then there is the victor's story that is saying, we won an election, there were forces that wanted to take this election from us. So that is one of the critical issues. Is it an issue that is worth having Kenyans come out? If it was an issue that is not worth Kenyans coming out, I am sure Raila would be isolated. He would have drove all the way from JKIA, passed through Kamukunji, and realizes that there is no Kenyan at Kamukunji, no one is interested in this issue. He would have gone to Kararapon, Karen, stick at home. But Kenyans came out, meaning if it is an issue of electoral justice, and we are not contesting who is the president.
Don't you as a Kenyan feel perhaps in a certain way held hostage by these political statements that have been held, because 2022 presidential election was settled at the Supreme Court? Well, of course, it is within their democratic right to raise the questions that they feel were not answered by the Supreme Court. But as a Kenyan, are we not supposed to move on?
You see, if Kenyans move on, it means that everything is okay, yeah? And there are Kenyans who've moved on. But we have a country where there are Kenyans who still go to these barazas. And you see, they're not going to say that the Supreme Court needs to change its decision. They're just going there to express themselves. And you see, the Constitution of Kenya is also giving them that, you know, platform.
To what end game?
No. Yeah, that's the question we need to ask ourselves.
Right.
To what end game? These are issues. Are they issues that Kenyans are supposed to exercise their minds on and discuss for the benefit of Kenyans? Okay. Or are there politicians who are taking advantage of Kenyans to write on these barazas for their own political expedience?
All right.
And then issue number 2, and I'll tell you, issue number 2 is an issue that the current regime can sort. And for as long as that issue remains an issue in the public domain, they would still have a problem. In fact, the only way they can avert the possibility of a handshake and all this is to change the lives of Kenyans. If there is anything that this government should thank God for, is that they won an election because of the common mwananchi. The common mwananchi, which in their own words, rose up against the system. The common mwananchi who rose up against the deep state. If they change the lives of the common mwananchi, no one would mobilize the common mwananchi against this government.
All right.
So where we are today, those two issues will remain being issues, and for as long as Kenyans come out, issue number 1, electoral justice. Issue number 2, the cost of living. I mean, these guys have the time to come and listen to someone who arouses hope that at least life is not good, but if we take this direction, then things can change. Okay. And if Raila embodies that, now, if Raila embodies that, I mean, it's not for people to start saying that Raila needs to reinvent it himself. If the people associate with what Raila talks about, and by the way, it is not.
But still, the big question is,
it is not Raila who came up with the whistleblowers thing. Yeah, let us just be clear that Raila is giving it gravitas, but that originated from Jubilee. You know,
and Jubilee falls under the Azimio coalition policy.
And that's what I'm saying. This is a political. A political statement that is made, and it you know, the moment it resonates with Kenya, because politics is about distribution and allocation of resources. So we may want to divorce ourselves from the individuals to the issues. That is the point I'm making.
All right, let's hear from Dismas. Raila's end game. What do we hope perhaps to expect from his political statements recently?
Well, you know, give him credit. Raila is an enigma in the Kenyan political space. And he understands, or rather he's got a very superior understanding of the typical Kenyan voter. And let's ask ourselves the purpose of the Kamkunji meeting. The first purpose of the Kamkunji meeting was to dilute the visit by President Ruto to Nyanza province. I mean, to Luo Nyanza. Because you recall all the...
But how would you come to that conclusion?
Yeah. I'm going to put my premises and I come to the conclusion. Mm-hmm. You recall that during the visit, President Ruto was received by all elected leaders, and he had huge crowds, and all of them were saying, Mr. President, tunaomba maendeleo. In fact, I understand he held courts with all the elected leaders so that he harmonizes their development priorities. That must have sent shockwaves to him that how come my very stronghold, my base, is giving President Ruto a red carpet reception? That's number 1. Number 2, Raila scores very highly in product marketing. And you remember every 5 years, he engages in brand refresh or brand reinvigoration. The last 5 years, he saw himself as the people's president, which invigorated his brand. And also this time round, he was using Kamkunji to invigorate his brand by saying, I reject the presidential elections. However, he says he rejects the presidential election after the horse has bolted, after the train has left the station. In fact, if he thinks the presidential election is nothing to write home, he should probably consider resigning his international assignments that have got the blessings of the Kenyan government or President Ruto. For instance, when you serve in these AU roles or as a special peace envoy like President Kenyatta, you do it with the blessing of President Ruto. Now, if indeed Raila rejects the win of President Ruto, then he should resign his role as the African Union representative, because it means he is representing an illegitimate government. He should also tell his daughter to do the same, because we are talking about a presidential election in Kenya whose leadership you reject. Thirdly, he needs to give his voters false hope that in fact we have been winning this election, but our victory has been snatched. So he's given that hope right from President from President Moi now to President Ruto. Now, when you talk about these anonymous whistleblower, who is linked to Jubilee, and Jubilee is a key cog of Azimio. And you and I have been in politics for a very long time to know that there are no accidents in politics. To know that everything is a choreography. People who manage politics score an A in event management in doing a critical path analysis. So this whistleblower did not come from Mosocho or from the moon and say, Eureka, the votes were stolen. No. You even remember what Mr. Jeremiah Kioni said, that in fact in Mount Kenya, from the votes we've counted, so far it's 2.1 million votes, we got more votes than President Ruto. So this is part of a script. But at the end of the day, we have to appreciate something, that Raila is an enigma, and Raila will get a crowd wherever he goes. If he goes to my home in Mosocho this morning, he's going to get a crowd. But again, that's a reflection that during the last 5 years, under the Handshake Brothers, the economy was mismanaged, because it should worry any leader that on a Monday morning, you love Kamkunji packed to the rafters. You cannot tell me that these are people who work as bank tellers, or they are, you know, somebody has left a bank, or Professor Will has left his lecture hall to come and attend this rally. When you see those numbers, instead of giving yourself a pat on the back, you must ask yourself, as a leader, what am I doing to give these guys not just hope, because you know hope is not a strategy, but you know tangible leadership. In fact, what one would have expected, because Professor Ndung has released his budget proposals, one would have expected that during that rally they would have offered criticism to those proposals, because you remember during that meeting nobody discussed economics, and right now the elephant in the room is economics. But as my colleagues have indicated, at the end of the day, we need to sort out IBC, and we have said times above number, it's not becoming a broken record, that we must have predictable systems for unpredictable outcomes. And then when you have these commissions, they will serve as a manual. But more important, there must be criminal penalties and pecuniary penalties for anybody who attempts to frustrate the will of Mura, whether it's voting for an MCA or for a president. Because right now what happens is, you frustrate the will of Mura, you attempt to bribe IBC officials, then you go back to your favorite restaurant, have your pepper steak and a single malt whiskey, you are whistling away, while in fact the nation is in some sort of a bubble. You create attention. So we should have people behind bars, and we can get best practices. The US has been investigating the insurrection, or, you know, the allegations around Donald Trump. And even Brazil is about to start doing the same. Because if we do not address this critical issue of electoral justice, then people will stop voting, because they'll know it doesn't matter how I vote. A few guys are going to compromise the process. So in my view, if anybody is rejecting these elections, actually, if Mr. Raila Odinga rejects the win of Ruto, can he discipline all the Azimio leaders who have been rolling out the red carpet for William Ruto, starting with Gladys Wanga?
But isn't it Raila Odinga himself who called and asked the elected leaders to accept, you know, the development agenda that the government was proposing in those areas? Now that is a contradiction, because you are saying you do not recognize William Ruto as the president, but at the same time you are telling your elected leaders from Azimio to roll out the red carpet. Actually, if you go through the press today, two governors... For the purposes of, you know, the citizens on the common Mwananchi to benefit from what the government is offering, right? You know, I'm not a lawyer, but I've interacted with lawyers, and they say that you approach the courts with clean hands. So how can you say, roll out the red carpet for President Ruto in the morning, and then in the afternoon you say, I do not recognize him? Why can't you start by disciplining Gladys Wanga, James Orengo, and any other person who has held meetings with him? And you know, at the end of the day, as Kenyans, we really need to wake up and smell the coffee. That with all these politics, when he says he's rejecting the win of President Ruto, whose interest is he actually serving? Is he serving his selfish interest, or is he serving the voters' interest? And are these selfish interests, all of them, are they aligned to our national and public interest? Because if he rejects the vote, how will that affect the economy? Will it compromise the economic growth? Because at the end of the day, Kenyans, we must run away from this Stockholm syndrome, where we are falling in love with our captors.
They give us a beating. They frustrate us. But again, when we see them, we say Hail Mary.
Okay. Thank you, Dismas. 10 seconds each, Hesbon and then Jim as we wind up this conversation.
Well, I think Dismas has made very serious points.
Right.
When there was that baraza at Kamkunji, nothing about the economy, nothing about what Governor Ndungu, CS Ndungu was presented was discussed. But I think it's important to also note that it is because of the economy that we had those people there.
Okay.
So when he says that a leader should be worried, the question we need to ask ourselves, does that worry leaders enough for them to be uncomfortable so much so that they sort our problems? Okay. And let us not run away from the issue of politicians will do their politics. They will say you can work with the government. They'll say we don't recognize this government. But at the end of the day, as Kenyans, we need to focus on the issues. Are these issues that we are supposed to discuss? And will these issues benefit Kenyans?
All right.
And not necessarily serve the expedient interest of politicians?
Politicians, right. Jim, very quickly.
I would equally say, I think, so on the issue of the economy, one of the things that he mentioned was he calls on Kenyans to sort of refuse or bring down the punitive taxes that are being imposed by this regime.
Right.
And there's a system in place. Raila Odinga might not recognize William Ruto as president in his individual capacity, but facts are facts. Ruto is president. Whether he recognizes him or not, Ruto is the president. And as the president, he's taking out his mandate as president, and the other elected leaders are allowed to do so. Allow me in very brief seconds, there's a topic that we covered that I did not say anything about, that was on education, and we had said that the passing rate was at 19%. Only 19% of candidates qualified for university. If you add those who can go to technical colleges, it comes to about 30%.
Right.
You have 70% of those kids who cannot get to school. And then we are having an entire Senate Committee of Education discussing cheating instead of what is the plight of the millions of Kenyans who cannot access higher education. What happens to their futures? Our problem is the system. The cheating is just a symptom of the bigger problem.
But there is a whole systemic issue that needs to be addressed. All right, thank you so much. Jim India, political governance analyst, Hesbon Owila, media and political communications expert, Dismas Mokua, political risk analyst. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming in this morning to have this conversation. We shall be seeing at least what will be happening in the next couple of days, and on Sunday as well. Some of those political statements we'll be analyzing those next week. Thank you so much for watching. See you tomorrow. Have yourself a good morning. Your World is coming up shortly in just a few minutes. My name is Zainab Ismail.
Jake cleans and kills 99.9% of illness-causing germs and COVID-19 in your home. Jake, your family's guardian against germs and COVID-19.
Are you convinced that you're not in love with me anymore? That you want to leave me?
Listen, I'm not going to leave you.
I know that it's been difficult and many things have happened, but I want us to fix our marriage.
So do I, Jenny.
I want us both to do something in order to fix our relationship.
So you're going to live here? Yes, just for a couple of days. Oh, and you weren't going to tell me anything?
Well, it's just I hadn't thought about it. Because there's nothing wrong with it, you know?
Well, yes. I just hope the two of you behave.
It had to be you.
To protect our family from germs that cause illness when it's cold, we use Dettol soap.
Dettol soap with germ defense gives you protection. When it's cold, germs are transferred in different ways, and Dettol soap's germ defense protects you from up to 100 illness-causing germs. Be Dettol sure.
Are you ready? Who said January has to be in January? NTV is about to make this season easier for you and your pocket. Yes, then January Bonanza is here we are offering you great shopping deals, big discounts and back to school offers. Just walk over to the National Archives from the 26th to the 28th of January and enjoy crazy January offers all day. MTV Entertainment is gonna be rocking the stage as you get to shop and buy from the biggest shopping deals ever. It's a January bonanza for you and your pocket.
Wagwan kila saa kutoka saa 1 hadi saa 4 ndani ya radio 96.3 #JamDownKE, na pia pale kwenye NTV kutoka mazama saa 4 hadi saa 6 jawote nitakuwa nakuja hapo na reggae ama Jam Down News, na hisa hato tunaongeleani get to know who is the most successful reggae and dancehall artist na Jamaica, au sio?
Na sisi tunaingia pale na miondoko mtu wangu, tunasababisha vile inafaa. The best of roots reggae and dancehall music mtu wangu. Chicks Kapenga alongside the illest and the toughest DJ Ponde 254.
Yema nipate kwenye Dex mazeni kiwapa all the way from Kingston Jamaica to 254. DJ Mo right here and the most spice of course NTV Jam Down kila saa tu mazeni kuanzia saa 4 mpaka saa 6. We there.
Stay calm, my Rasta.
You're going to take your oxtail and then you're going to brown it.
It's the headquarters of good vibes.
So I should just kneel and begin to call on Jesus because I'm a bishop.
You know, Dr. Kingori, yes, you sound like a street fighter. Where did you grab it? Unataka noma.
Kingori, let me tell you something. Mimi mtu angenipata saa hiyo nikiwa first year angeangukia bibi mzuri.
You know, they always say smart women, where to catch them is with love.
Kingori, I love how your suit looks. I love you in a suit, I love you in a t-shirt.
As in any example, you actually mean that.
Fungua akili ya msee ama kichwa ya msee ukapata vile watu husema jamaa ana akili.
Tunaweza toa nyama kwa huko nyuma tuweke kwa
kifua. Sisi mtu anakuwa na roho chafu sana.
Na ukidive inahesabiwa?
Yes, ndio ukiwin, udive win si umewin.
Hiyo ndio tizi unafaa upige. Napiganga tu tizi ya 90 meters ya kwanza, alafu nikifika 90 meters na fly. Every Friday on NTV 7:30 p.m.
Want to know the biggest story of the week? Do not worry. The Weekly Review has got you covered for in-depth analysis of politics, business, governance, as well as social issues. The Weekly Review covers it all. For well-researched, exclusive and investigative content, read the Weekly Review every Sunday on Nation e-paper and on www.nation.africa, free of charge.
Ghana is facing its worst economic turmoil in a generation. Financial freedom is on the to-do list for most citizens, which is why I'm here to walk you